Great. So I think we're ready to go. Yes, so welcome everyone to our webinar. My name is Gunnar Herzig. I'm the Managing Director of the World Forum Offshore Wind, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting today's WFO webinar on offshore wind market updates, Spain, France, and Poland. And we have three great speakers with us today. We have Luis Gonzalez Pinto, COO at SATH Offshore Technologies, then Kevin Feldman, Director at Green Giraffe, and John McAskill, Group Marketing Director at OWC Offshore Wind Consultants. And before we hear from our speakers, a few words about WFO and what we as the World Forum Offshore Wind do. So as you can see, we are a non-profit organization founded in 2018, focusing exclusively on offshore wind, nothing else, and representing the complete offshore wind value chain via our members. And we have an international setup with offices in Hamburg and Singapore, and always pushing for offshore wind on a global scale. And then what do we do in terms of activities? Very straightforward, three things. We lobby for offshore wind, especially in new upcoming offshore wind markets. We inform about offshore wind via all our media channels, documents, reports, or webinars such as this one. And we connect the global offshore wind industry and players from all around the world via summits, whether it's in the real world or now on a virtual level, always trying to connect players from across continents. And then just to give you a quick idea of who our members are, very diverse range of members, including utility companies, component manufacturers, service firms, law firms, other organizations, and also a very international group of members, including companies from Europe, North America, Asia Pacific, and really, yeah, we're always keen on bringing in more members from more offshore wind markets around the world. So I think, yeah, that's it from my side. And of course, if you are not yet a member of WFO, please join us. And if you're interested, let us know. On our website, you can find all our contact details, and it would be fantastic to welcome, yeah, always new members to our group of WFO companies. So that was it from my side, and now it's my great pleasure to hand it over to Luis Gonzalez Pinto, COO at SATH Offshore Technologies, to tell us more about the current state of offshore wind energy in Spain. Luis, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gunnar. And thank you for all of you to attend this webinar. I think it's quite exciting. I think we are looking and we are receiving quite a lot of interest by the nascent Spanish market. And I'm here to give you a little bit a broad view of the Spanish market as a whole, and some update of the current status. So first things first, who we are, SATH Offshore. SATH Offshore is a consultancy focused on blue economy and the blue economy field. We are located in Bilbao, and we are about 30 people, more than 30 people already, quite focused on floating wind, which is our core business, and most of it on our technology SATH. So as said, we kind of do other kind of works in terms of the blue economy, mainly because when we see they add value, but most of what we do is our technology SATH, which is this technology you can see here, and I'm pretty sure that you have heard about, which is a quite innovative technology, basically coming from a civil engineering perspective of developing floating structures. And there are four core elements, without going into much detail, which is the employment of concrete and the way we use it to optimize the amount of concrete we use. At the same time, we also have this with this shape which allows us to use a low draft, and we have this single point mooring which helps the platform to align with the wind. But without getting too much in commercial. Basically now our latest project we are working at the moment is the SATH, which is a project we're working with the support with RWE, in which we are going to install a 2 megawatt floater on the Basque Coast near our offices, and it's going to be commissioned in 2022. The latest news is that the works have already started and the site preparation is underway, and we expect to start manufacturing the floaters at the end of December or beginning of January. But just going to our topic, I just wanted to summarize in a single slide the Spanish offshore wind in a single slide. Here you can see a map of the southern part of Europe and the Spanish coast and the Portuguese coast, and then also the Canary Islands, which I think is one of the most interesting parts in Spain to develop floating wind. As said, Spain is characterized by deep waters, so almost all the resources are available in deep waters will require floating wind. For the moment, there have only been two prototypes installed, one from Way to Power off an Ocean in the Canary Islands, and another from SATH in Santander. There is quite a lot of push for floating wind, not only as a way to generate clean electricity, but mainly also as an opportunity for the Spanish company to develop technologies and capacities and capabilities. This is quite a key element for the Spanish government, which is pushing to try to help Spanish companies to get further experience in offshore wind and to be able to be exporting technology all over the world. That's why later on I will give you some very quick view on the Spanish ecosystem of offshore wind. Now most of the projects are focused on pre-commercial of up to 50 megawatt, mainly based on the previous legislation, which allowed a simplified procedure for projects of up to 50 megawatt. But then the second part is going to be much more focused on the next steps. We are going to be focused on commercial projects of the hundreds of megawatts, and there is quite a lot of interest as we are receiving for different developers. The Spanish Wind Association, the Asociación Eólica Española, is targeting for between 2 and 3 gigawatts for 2030. It's quite ambitious and challenging objective, as we know, because at the moment there is almost zero bats installed in Spain, but it's quite a lot of interest of many developers around. So first of all, in terms of regulators, the leading party in regulation here is MITECO, which is the Ministry of Ecological Transition and Demographic Challenge. And also inside the ministry, IDAE, which is the Institute for Diversification and Energy Conservation, is developing most of the strategies and leading all the marine planning. Yes, in terms of developers, obviously we have to speak about Iberdrola, Ocean Winds, formed between the former EDPR in offshore wind and ENGIE, Cobra, which is also working in Kincardine, but also other players like Naturgy, which is just made public a development to try to develop in Spain, and newcomers as Greenalia, which are developers coming from onshore wind. In any case, these are let's say the local developers, which with high capacities in Spain. But we also know that other developers such as Equinor are looking into the Spanish market. In terms of in technology developers, there are three main technologies. I can say that at the moment, SATH has already installed a reduced scale prototype and is in the development of. Is in the construction of the first 2 megawatt prototype, but there is also another technology from Way to Power, which installed in erosion. They installed a floater of 200 kilowatts in the Canary Islands, which they already decommissioned. And there is another prototype that is coming from Offshore Wind, which is under manufacturing, and they are going to install also in the Canary Islands 225 kilowatts. Then there are other technologies which are still at the tank testing level. So there is quite a support from the Spanish government to support this movement. In terms of supply chain, there's another key factor in Spain. There are many powerful. The supply chain is almost covering all the fields in floating offshore wind. We can say that we could even work 100% Spanish project only using Spanish manufacturing capabilities. We've got EPC contractors like Ferrovial and Dragados, important shipyards as Navantia, which has the facilities in Galicia and Andalusia, Siemens Gamesa as wind turbine manufacturer, but also leading companies like BCNI, leading company in the manufacturing of chains, or important companies like ICEA Wind or Wind and Renewables in terms of metalworks. There are many different R&D centers. There are already 2 open sea test centers like BIMEP, close to our offices in the Basque Country, and also Plocan in the Canary Islands, which have currently the possibility of testing floating turbines. There is also leading associations, which is the Asociación Empresarial Eólica, which is the Wind Energy Association, but also APA, which is also leading, helping the development. And then there are multiple energy clusters, but we would like to underline the Basque Energy Cluster, which we take part actively, which is taking quite a lot of moving in terms of movement in terms of floating wind. So which is the current status? We are still with the royal decrees, the old royal decree 1028 for 27, which regulated the procedure. This has to be modified, but many developers are considering using this still in place royal decree for the simplified regulation of the under 550 megawatt project. Now the Spanish government is working on the roadmap for the offshore wind and marine energy definition. This is going to they end up the consultation procedures in July. So we expect to have by the end of this year this roadmap, which is going to define the strategy towards offshore wind from the Spanish government. There is going to be, as a consequence, a new permitting procedure, which is going to simplify and be clearer in terms of the competition process for the locations, and also in terms of the grid connection. Currently, the problem with the old royal decree is that the grid connection reserve that the royal decree provides is too short for the long time of developing an offshore wind project. Next step is going to be the spatial planning, which is key, which is called the Planes de Ordenación del Espacio Marítimo, which is going to define how offshore wind is going to be integrated with the other uses of the marine territories. This is going to be very important because, as we are going to see in the next point, is when we analyze the different regions in Spain in terms of developing projects, there is going to be many points where you have to avoid the conflict with other uses of the sea. At the same time, I think there is quite a movement in terms of launching, and many developers are eager to start working on the auction process. But I think first thing first, we need to clarify how to obtain the maritime sea spatial planning, and also the grid connection prior to define and be able to see which support is going to be established by the Spanish government. The Spanish Wind Agency released this chart on the planning, the expected planning, which is quite ideal, as it's stated at the top, and there is going to be a significant delay in terms of the process, and we do not expect to have a new royal decree which establishes the procedures for the permitting at least until next year. And also we think that there is going to be a delay in the maritime spatial planning, and we don't think it's very likely to have an auction for the Canary Islands in 2021. Probably it's going to move to 2022. But as said, this is going to be released pretty quickly. We expect to have more information from the Spanish government before the end of the year. So finally, just to end up this, I think just to give you some insight of how we see the different areas in Spain for the offshore wind. So we see mainly the Canary Islands, Galicia. Then we have clustered the whole Cantabrian Sea with Asturias, Cantabria, and the Basque Country, Andalusia, and then Catalonia. So I think the Canary Islands are the hotspot for most developers. I think that is the place where we have found more interest. It is clear that the Canary Islands have the best wind resource. They also have a higher cost of energy because they are not connected to the Spanish grid, and they are still employing fuel generation, and that's causing quite a higher cost. And there is also a place where they have they want to diversify and create a new industry for the high unemployment present in the region. There is also a quite ambitious objective established by the general government of establishing 300 megawatts of installation for 2025. Those are the reasons to be really optimistic of the Canary Islands, but we also think that there is a quite other reasons to be a little bit less optimistic. We think that the Canaries are going to develop. Sorry, I think I somehow touched the screen. Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me for this. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic, but also there are some limitations in terms of the Canary Islands. We see that the Canary Islands have limited power to be connected, so they are really favorable place to exploit the wind resource. But also we think that there is limitations, as you can see on this schedule on the right side, that the limitations in terms of power to be connected to the grid is high. When we have the biggest island in Gran Canaria, which are 250 megawatts of total power to be connected realistically to the grid. Also, we have quite deep waters as we go far away, but I think the limitation in terms of the grid is going to be the biggest point. Also, reduced supply chain. I think there is a reduced supply chain in terms of in Canary Islands, and that's going to probably increase the cost of projects. And also we see that as this is the hot spot, there is already a massive competition between different developers to develop in the Canary Islands. So from our point of view, is maybe not is maybe the best place to exploit offshore wind, but maybe it's not the best commercial opportunity under our opinion. Then we've got Galicia, which is also on the northeast northwest of the Spanish Peninsula, of the Iberian Peninsula, sorry, and there is also the best wind resource in the Iberian Peninsula with high speed. There is a massive supply chain. We've got Navantia and the Port of A Coruña, and there is quite also a quite view of the opportunity of the offshore wind to be a job creator for Galicia, which has a quite high rate of unemployment. And it makes sense also based on the experience of Galicia as one of the leading regions for onshore wind in Spain. And nevertheless, there are other factors to be considered in Galicia as to make us be a little bit less optimistic. First of all is the importance of fisheries in Galicia. The amount of protected areas in Galicia and the Galician coast. which makes also that there is going to be quite a competition for the marine space, and we think that one of the key elements for the success of Galicia as a offshore wind region is the management of the local stakeholders. Also, there is one of the worst harsh environment and the most demanding environment for floating wind. Then we've got this aggregation of what we call ACBC, Asturias, Canary, and Basque Country, with the Cantabrian Sea, and we've got the general rule of thumb that the more we move to the east, the less wind we've got. First, we've got Asturias, we've got a big opportunity in terms of all the coal plants that are going off, and we think that that's going to create an opportunity for the grid absorption of offshore wind. Also, it's also quite depressed region, which has an opportunity to develop new jobs in terms of by developing this offshore wind industry. Also, a supply chain which is already working in offshore wind with Windar and the Port of Avilés, and multiple companies already working on offshore wind since many years ago. So there's an opportunity. Then, as we move a little bit to the east, we've got Cantabria, which has a lot of interest on marine energies with the industrial in situ hydraulica Cantabria and the clusters working in trying to create a new industry around marine energies, and also they are looking for this new job creation. And then we go to the Basque Autonomous Region, where we have a really powerful supply chain. I think we can almost do almost integrally any offshore wind project being completely manufactured by local suppliers. We also see that the Basque Autonomous Region is quite density area, so we have a lot of population in really reduced space. We have reduced solar power, and we think that it's very likely that decarbonization of the Basque Country is going to come through offshore wind, because it's going to be, due to the high populated areas, limited possibility to install onshore wind. And also it's an industrial hub. It's quite an industrial hub with many industries and many industrial capabilities and capacities. On the other side, we see that there is a limited wind resource. So probably we are going to go to areas where we are going to have a resource similar to what we can find in Japan and Korea. Then we've got Andalusia, which also has some certain areas of very good wind resource. There is some supply chain available, particularly with the massive ports and infrastructure from Navantia, and there is also quite a important push from the Andalusian government to try to push renewable energies to create new jobs. The main problems with Andalusia is going to be the massive traffic that you are going to find in the Mediterranean Sea, some importance of tourism, and some of the protected areas. But we see several areas that could be of interest in Andalusia. Finally, we've got Catalonia, where there are two main areas where we have wind resource. One is near the Delta del Ebre, but we think that it's really complicated due to the environmental issues you are going to face there. And finally, just close to the French border, there is another area, but also I think there is going to be quite problematic in terms of managing the local stakeholders. And that's all from my side. I hope, thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was of interest.
Excellent, great. Thank you very much, Luis, for this great presentation. Fantastic to learn more about what's going on in terms of offshore wind in Spain. And just a quick word to our audience, if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, and then you can type in any questions which we can answer at the end of the webinar. So with that, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Kevin Feldman from Green Giraffe, who's going to talk about offshore wind in France. Kevin, over to you. I think your microphone is still muted. If you just unmute your mic.
There we go. The classic classic mute button. So I assume you can see my screen. Let me know if not. But in any case, thank you all for joining. My name is Kevin Feldman, and so I'll give you a brief update on offshore wind in France. I'll keep it short and concise given the format requested, and I'll focus on past and future tenders. Just a word about myself. I've been working in infrastructure and renewables for about 15 years. And I've been working since 2016 for Green Giraffe out of the Paris office. Before I dive into offshore wind in France, let me tell you a little bit about Green Giraffe, which was founded about 10 years ago. We're a financial advisor. We're specialized in renewable energy projects. And we were involved in the very first project financings in offshore wind, in the very infancy of the industry. And we're still very active in the sector. I'd say roughly 2/3 of our revenue is still offshore wind related, but we also work on other renewable energy technologies. We now have offices in 7 countries. So this slide actually shows 6, but we have recently opened a Singapore office. So the slide is slightly out of date, but soon we'll be showing this with 6 countries. And we're now about 100 employees. And the type of work we do, we support in project and corporate finance, M&A processes, either buy side or sell side, tender support, strategic advisory, contracting. So it's a pretty wide spectrum of activities that we can support with. And specifically for France, we've been involved in all of the tender rounds that have occurred that I'll take you through for fixed bottom. And we've been involved in M&A processes, both on the seller side and the buyer side for offshore wind in France. So we could talk at length about offshore wind in general, about offshore wind in France. I'll try to keep it relatively short, but happy to take any questions after that about general subjects. So first, I'll take you through a little bit of the historical context, then a little bit of a snapshot of where we are today, and then we can talk about what's coming next. So from a kind of theoretical potential, there are hundreds of gigawatts of potential gigawatts of offshore wind that can be built, both fixed bottom and offshore wind. To date, only 3.6 gigawatts have been awarded. These have exclusively been awarded through public tenders. And so they've been competitive public tenders. And France actually was pretty early in launching these tenders. And I'll show you a little bit of the detail there. Ultimately, thanks to that large potential, ultimately, it is expected that France catches up with other countries in Europe and would be in the probably top 4 behind the UK and Germany and the Netherlands in terms of installed offshore wind capacity. So there's quite a bit of potential there. So this slide, you'll see round 1, 2, and 3. There's a little asterisk next to round 1. Let me just take you through that asterisk. Before round 1, there was actually a round 0 in a way that actually occurred in 2004. And there was a single project that was awarded back then for 100 megawatts. The tariff back then, I think, was around 100 euros a megawatt hour. Essentially, the project didn't really go anywhere, and it was too early at that stage, and the tariff was probably too low at that stage to make it work. Just wanted to footnote to make sure you had that context, but officially, when people think about the tender rounds in France, they really start with round 1, which started in July of 2011. And I'll group round 1 and 2 as kind of a single block in my comments. The main difference obviously being the number of awards that were that were done. So for round one, you can see there's four bullet points there. So there were 4 projects that were awarded to different consortia. And in round two, there were 2 awards done. That's the main difference, but otherwise rounds 1 and 2 are actually pretty similar. The criteria for the award, you can see here, is a mix of local content and industrial plan weighing 40%, the tariff itself 40%, and then environmental impact. A lot of the criteria there were qualitative in nature, I would say, and there was therefore a high weighting on, let's say, non-tariff and non-quantitative criteria for the award back then. It was also important for the French state to capture the local jobs and in that nascent industry to try to have the supply chain based out of France. So the local content was understandably an important part of the procurement process from the French state. And that's actually why you'll see, I'll mention it a little later on, but that's why you'll see that GE and Siemens Gamesa have local, or will have local, plants to be able to supply the equipment that's produced locally in France for some of these round 1 and 2 projects. Back then, the scope included the offshore substation, so that was for the project sponsor to build, and you'll see that will have changed. And in the last row there, you'll see what the tariff is. So we're showing here the tariff around 150 megawatt hours for both rounds 1 and 2. This is after renegotiation in 2018. And let me explain a little bit of the context there. So back when these were awarded, the tariffs were more in the 200 plus euros per megawatt hour. And you'll see that the time when these were awarded and where the projects are expected to hit COD is relatively long if you compare it to other jurisdictions. And essentially, the development process has taken longer than initially expected. The main reasons are that the regulatory context and framework wasn't fully fleshed out, was somewhat uncharted at the time. The French government was thinking there would be kind of a copy paste from solar or onshore wind, and they'd be able to just replicate that, and the permitting process would look very similar. In effect, it wasn't, right? So there was a lot of discovery of what the regulation needed, how it needed to change. And there were also a lot of appeal windows in the permitting process that allowed opponents to really slow down the development process and lodge appeals at different jurisdiction levels. So that really slowed down the development process, which then created a disconnect between the tariffs that were awarded and where the industry was or is today. And so that disconnect really put the French state in a kind of a tight spot where they were actually in the process of obtaining state aid clearance for the tariffs in 2018, and realized that the European Commission that conducts the state aid process would basically say there's a disconnect here, right? That the tariffs no longer reflect where the industry is. So that's what really prompted these renegotiations. And so it's understood that the tariffs are, I think every project is a slightly different tariff with maybe a slightly different set of renegotiation terms, but roughly speaking, it's understood that the tariffs are around 150 euros a megawatt hour after these recent renegotiations. So maybe I can switch to round 3, where things have started to really change. And there was a lot of lessons that were learned from rounds 1 and 2, a lot of new regulation that was put in place. So I'll take you through one by one from in the table here. So you'll see that the timeline here spanned essentially 2017, 2018, and part of 2019. Part of the reason for that long timeline was that One is that actually there were some renegotiations on round 1 and 2, which to some extent slowed down a little bit round 3. There was also a new competitive process that was done for the first time, whereby the French state invited pre-selected bidders into a dialogue where, where they essentially sent the draft tender specifications and welcomed comments on the tender specifications to ensure that the process was as competitive as possible, as balanced as possible, and allowed every type of bidder to participate. The criteria for the award were also reviewed and made essentially all quantitative. So even though it says 20% is attributed to environmental impact, even the environmental impact was based on quantitative criteria. So it was really made more transparent, more objective, and a higher weighting on the tariff itself, with 80% essentially, mostly on the bid tariff itself, also to some extent on the financial robustness of the proposal. Another important difference is that the scope changed, and the offshore substation was moved from the scope of the project sponsor to the grid operator, RTE. Again, in that that idea of de-risking the project and allocating to the most appropriate party each part of the project. So the idea, looking at other countries, France realized maybe there are some best practices we can take into account. You know, for example, in Germany, we see that things are working relatively well, that the grid operator can build the offshore substations in this kind of centralized planning way. So they went with that approach and took that out of the technical scope of the projects themselves. Another important difference is that they realized some pre-permitting work would greatly enhance the de-risking of the projects. So doing some public inquiries before the bid, also conducting some technical analyses and making these available to the bidders is something that they saw was a best practice. And they started doing that with round 3, and that's expected to occur in the next tenders as well. It should be noted that they don't go so far as maybe the Dutch and like really doing the full geotechnical campaign, but nevertheless, it's still a great move forward in terms of de-risking the bids and ensuring that the tenders are as competitive as possible. And so for round 3, I think we can, if you see the tariff that was awarded to the EDF consortium, EDF Energy and Enbridge, at 44 euros a megawatt hour, I think it's seen as essentially a very successful tender. There were 7 bids submitted. The price was quite competitive, as you can see. So it was quite a success, and it did attract, out of these 7 offers, a lot of international top players have submitted bids there. So France, this was, the previous slide was really about fixed bottom. France really has ambitions also in floating, and they launched tenders back in 2015, and they are essentially one of the countries that's at the forefront of floating offshore wind. And the approach that the French state had back then for that first tender was to try to diversify the technologies that were awarded. Still early days, still early to really put all your eggs in one basket. So diversification in terms of technologies and also in terms of the developers. But also you'll see that the size of the project is much smaller, right? Here it's 20 to 30 megawatts versus the around 500 megawatt projects that were awarded for fixed bottom. And these are really pilot projects in that sense. And the idea is to really test the waters, and no pun intended, kickstart the industry and the supply chain and really pave the way for larger projects. Yep. So where are we today? At the moment, there are no utility scale projects that are operating yet, but the first 2 projects have reached financial close and are under construction, and they are project financed. These are 2 EDF projects, so the Saint-Nazaire project and Fécamp. And lenders have really shown a large appetite for these French offshore wind projects. And there's really this will be the first of a series of projects. The projects that are in the table on the right here, all these blue projects, will be reaching financial close relatively soon. Some of them, most of them should be project finance. Some of them are expected to be built on balance sheet. For example, Iberdrola's Saint-Brieuc project would probably be built on balance sheet, but a lot of the rest is expected to be project finance. Oops. There we go. Okay. So just briefly on the, let's say, the roadmap. I won't take you through every number on here, but the point of this slide is to show that France has this PPE, Programmation Pluriannuelle de l'Énergie, which is the energy roadmap, which sets the targets. These are clear targets with a real political backing behind it. And in a nutshell, the idea is to get to 40% renewables by 2030. Right? That's the headline number to have in mind. And if you zoom into the renewables, so what is that 40% renewables? Well, there's some component which will be hydro, onshore wind, solar, but there's also an important component not to be neglected, which is the offshore wind piece. And the idea is that this would contribute 5 to 6 gigawatts of operating offshore wind by 2028, and we're expecting in total 8 gigawatts of offshore wind to be tendered by 2028. So let me take you through the next couple slides to show a little bit what we're expecting for the future. So I touched upon a lot of the content on this slide. I won't take you through, it's quite wordy, but I'll just touch upon it relatively quickly. New laws have passed to really streamline the process of the development of the tender process as well, right? So tender criteria are clear, quantitative, objective, and transparent, which obviously attracts international bidders and makes the process pretty open to competition, which is obviously what the government's looking for. But the permitting process, once you've won, is also streamlined. So there's now fewer permits required. There's also, instead of having multiple levels of jurisdiction, if appeals are lodged, there's now single points of jurisdiction. It was the Cour d'appel de Nantes. They're now actually moving it to the Conseil d'État. So the idea is really to streamline things as possible and make it much more efficient in terms of development timeline. The competitive dialogue process, which I alluded to earlier, also is a change in mindset from the French government, where they really invite feedback from the market to ensure the process is competitive, open to all, fair, etc. And the idea of the pre-permitting work being done by the French state, with technical studies being conducted, but also public inquiries to, again, de-risk that permitting phase. So that's really the philosophy between the next tenders, which I'm showing here on the last slide. There's more to come, right? And there's a clear timeline for the next tenders. I mentioned before this kind of 8 gigawatts of offshore wind capacity to be tendered by 2028, with the calendar here showing the next one would be fixed bottom, but the idea would be to alternate between floating and fixed bottom, with certain geographies that have been predetermined. The specific zones have not yet, the specific sites have not yet been determined. And there's also indication of where the prices should be at a maximum with these price caps that you can see here. So a couple of things just to, it's a very exciting roadmap, just to kind of also put a word of caution and things to look out for and be cognizant of. Developers are calling for clear planning and more specific identification of the sites, so that they can already start the designs, the studies, and start de-risking the bids, essentially. And the other aspect there is also to ensure there's really effective coordination with RTE, the grid operator who's going to be building the offshore substations, and ensuring that there is available grid capacity for these new projects and these specific sites that should be identified. So for the next tender that should start relatively soon, we understand it could start within a few weeks from now for the pre-selection phase. There are a couple zones being debated, as we understand, that could be the ones for this 1 gigawatt tender. So there's, just to recap, there's really strong fundamentals. France is obviously an advanced economy, de-risked economy to a large extent, and there's significant growth in offshore wind that's been clearly laid out with the energy roadmap. There's been consistent political backing for that offshore wind industry to come in online. There's a local supply chain that's been really put in place through the rounds 1 and 2 local content requirements. And the support system in France, just a word on that, it's a 20-year CFD now, which is essentially government backed, right? So it's quite appealing to both lenders and equity investors or sponsors, developers, given that it really provides a relatively long government-backed de-risked revenue stream compared to maybe other countries that are moving more to having revenue lines that are exposed to merchant risks, either fully or partially. So France is, there's quite a lot of promising things ahead. A lot of the teething issues from the early days have been mostly fleshed out from rounds 1 and 2, and now with round 3 and the next rounds, it's expected that it'll be a smoother process. And as I mentioned before, that France would catch up to the other European countries and become part of that, say, top 4 for countries for installed offshore wind.
Great.
So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kevin, for this very structured overview of offshore wind in France. And I think, conscious of time, without further ado, let's move on to our next speaker, John McCaskill, Group Marketing Director at OWC, to tell us a bit more about offshore wind in Poland. So, John, over to you.
Excellent. Is that coming through? Are you seeing the full screen?
Yep, perfect. Full screen.
Okay, excellent. So thank you, Gunnar and WFO, for inviting OWC and myself to this webinar. Fascinating coming after Lewis and Kevin on some excellent presentations on markets at different sort of parts of the growth curve. So with time, as Gunnar said, with what I've got a clock in my eye vision. OWC, the Offshore Wind Consultants, we're part of the Aqualis-Braemar Group. We're an independent marine engineering and adjusting consultant. We work in energy and oceans to de-risk and drive the energy transition. We work in renewables, the maritime or shipping, the oil and gas, and the power sectors from about 200 global locations. We've got a legacy that dates back to 1856, and apologies to any Latin speakers, quaere vera, or to seek the truth, is at the heart of all we do. It's actually our founding vision, value. So in terms of that legacy, 1856, the Salvage Association incorporated into Royal Charter in 1867, which is where the motto came from. OWC, or Offshore Wind Consultants, as it was the full name at the time, 2000 was established in 2011. I joined in 15. We were acquired by Aqualis Offshore in 2014. And then Braemar Technical Services joined the Aqualis family. So we're Aqualis-Braemar, and here we are today in 2020. OWC themselves, the Offshore Wind Consultants, we're an independent engineering and technical advisor. We are purely offshore wind. That's all we do. And we deliver studies or project development services, owners engineering, and due diligence to developers and investors. And Ian Bonnen and his very small team at the start, they'd actually been working on offshore wind farm construction since the 1990s. So we started with a foundation of quite deep expertise. But since 2001, we've worked on about 60 gigawatts of projects, which is about 85 projects. And we've got experience of all mature and emerging markets. We're very keen on getting boots on the ground quite quickly in emerging markets, so we can deploy that global expertise and, using the cliche, some local experience, because early in projects, that's absolutely vital. So we're in the UK, London, Edinburgh. You can see the cities there. We're in Asia, we're in the US. We've also got Luani now in Rio, which is not on that list. So all emerging markets. So Poland identified offshore wind as a key technology development opportunity when they published their Polish energy policy, or the PEP 240, and it recognized offshore wind as one of a strategic project for the energy transition in the Polish energy sector. Now, it's now became something that's not just for the Polish energy sector, it's actually a major economic driver as well. And of course, in the age of pandemic, it's also been labeled as part of its green growth strategy post-pandemic. It's anticipated that it can deliver up to about 11 gigawatts of installed capacity, more than any other new service. Now, the proposed maritime spatial plan has considered areas for offshore wind, which will take you through the developments. However, and you'll see that there's a lot of things that are laid down ready for this market to take off, but there's a couple of things that's recently dented that. And the first one I'm just going to mention here is that the recent draft of the Offshore Act, which we'll come to again, is going to simply cancel any proceedings or permits that aren't consistent with the new current and spatial plan. And that was a surprise to developers, and especially in markets that are yet to be proven. They're emerging, they're early markets, they don't like surprises. And there has been one or two developers that have actually backed off or are backing off from that market. It's dense appetites. The Dedicated Offshore Wind Act, which is under preparation despite the pandemic, and we'll be revisiting that, will be issued in the coming months. The first projects are going to be supported via a state aid mechanism, and notified to the EU state aid mechanism, while the future ones will use a CFD auction system, which will cover. The TSO has been building offshore wind into its plans. So it's in the process of connecting approximately 9 gigawatts, or planning to connect 9 gigawatts by 2035, with some grid improvements already planned. So 7 gigawatts of conditions being issued, with about over 3 gigawatts agreements in place with projects including the Baltic 3, Equinor and Polenergia's GVA3, and PG Baltica 1, 2 and 3. And the wind regimes are, we won't go into this in detail, but basically the wind regimes are very positive for the market also. So all in all, it's poised for growth. Now, if subsidy-free, in other words, but with a support mechanism, can be delivered in the UK and Holland, then it can be delivered in Poland. They're going to be adopting a very similar CFD-style mechanism. The maximum offshore wind farm support period will be about 25 years, starting from the date of the energy generation. The difference between the market price, which will be determined on market data, and the offshore wind farm energy price, so the actual wind farm energy price, will constitute the negative balance. If that balance is positive, however, the value will be settled on the subsequent periods. And if there's a surplus after the support period, then that offshore wind farm, the wind farm owner, will be obliged to return such surpluses to the settlement administrator in 6 monthly installments. Now, we're looking at 2 phases. So there's actually, you will see that there's actually 3 phases between here and 2030, which confusingly is phase 1 and phase 2, and phase 2 has 2 auctions in it. So phase 1 is a 2-sided contract for difference, but it's not competitive. It's between the investor, or the developer, and the regulator. Now, the awards of support under this formula will be time bound or time limited. In other words, they have to be agreed by June 2021. It should be noted that the period for award of state aid under the first phase has been shortened. In the January draft of the Offshore Act, it was planned that it would be the end of 2022, but that's been brought forward on the recent one. So there's not as much time to get those projects agreed or with a route to market. Now, in the second phase, the auctions, they are competitive auctions, the CFD auctions, which we know and love in the UK here. The first is going to be in 2025, and the second one about 2 years later. And each auction will carry a capacity of about 2.5 gigawatts. Now, the recent draft changed, because the earlier draft showed auctions in 23 and 28, but it was pushed back because of the increased volumes that were being planned in the first phase. So, and obviously those projects that get that secure that route to market will have to go through procurement and construction. So it was to ease out that pipeline flow, which was quite sensible at the time. So with that as sort of a summary, where does it sit at the moment? Well, there's a clear pathway to 10 gigawatts. There's a clear commitment to offshore wind politically on the government side. And now you go back 5 or 6 years ago and that wasn't the case, but there's a general agreement, as we've mentioned before. It's now seen as a major economic impactful development, and economies are needing to actually have those tools for the post-pandemic side. So there's a general agreement, which is excellent. The upcoming regulatory framework in the Offshore Act is a sensible support scheme. It's quite sensible. It doesn't carry significant surprises. It's got that sort of recognition from other sectors, and that's for the current and the future projects. And what is another quite positive aspect to this is that a significant number of the developers are state-owned companies with very strong, obvious links to the government. And they're having to deliver their own energy transition as they're moving from the brown energy economy to a green one. So the government will not want those to fail. So there is a significant political will to make sure that those plans for those state-owned companies don't fall flat on their face with sunk costs, etc. Another thing, we've seen a significant interest in international developers grow because they're looking at this market. There's a level of comfort in what they're seeing, and it looks like the projects you'll be able to develop economic cases for these projects. With that in mind, we don't like surprises, and obviously the surprise that was mentioned earlier. So there's a well-defined pathway towards achieving a 10 gigawatt, which is sort of an in the middle type of scenario, and the LCO estimates are in the range that we would want to see in Europe of between 50 and 70 euro per megawatt hours. Now, in terms of what does that look like in terms of the projects on the slate, we've got 10.4 projects that are in firm development. Some of these have agreements, grid agreements. Some of them are on the way to try and get grid agreements. And you can see the names there. There's a range of Equinor and Paul Energy, Baltic 1, Baltic 2 and 3. There's PGE. Now, two of the PGE projects, Baltica 2 and 3, you can see that Ørsted are very close to securing 50% equity in this project. So another vote of confidence from a very well-known international developer. RWE, Orlen with Baltic Power, EDPR with 2 projects, and Baltics 2 and 5. Now, the map on the right-hand side is one of our maps where we were looking at the geology of the offshore wind areas and the geohazards. The project lines with the black boundaries, they're those projects on the right-hand side, the ones releases, and the other ones are planned areas that are coming up. So what's going on just now? As hopefully we've seen in this quite whiz through, because it's getting near the time, surely all the parts are in place for takeoff. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. There is a big commitment. Representatives of the Polish government, the offshore sector, developers, supply chain, industry associations have also recently signed a letter of intent to commit themselves to join forces to develop this market in Poland. The TSO, as we've mentioned, have put offshore wind into their development plan, which includes infrastructure strengthening and also, interestingly and excitingly, some trans-border subsea links. But the government has presented the final draft just recently, and the Offshore Act needs to come through, and this is what I'm just going to finish on. All of a sudden in Poland, there's a bit of a political risk. The timeline, we are in November. The offshore plan, the Offshore Act, was hopefully going to be enacted into law end of this year. but the Parliament has been suspended. So it's now scheduled for January 21. Now, the reason that there's a risk is that the projects that are looking to negotiate these one-to-one CFD agreements in June, you need to have a framework in place, and that is that Offshore Act. If that framework isn't in place or reduces that time to the point where all these projects that are wanting this 5.9 gigawatts of projects that are looking for this, if that reduces where they fail to get those contracts in place, it means we will not be seeing construction in Poland post June 2021. Now, that doesn't mean just a delay. Actually, that could be it could jeopardize the whole offshore wind program in Poland. There's no demo projects in Poland. In effect, the projects that would be getting a route to market in June 2021 are commercial scale demo projects. They will be the projects that build the that has the infrastructure built for them, that has the supply chain built for them. Now, if they end up having to then chase the 2025 auction, the first thing is there's only about 2.5 gigawatts at the moment available in that auction. But the other thing is, markets are international now. Some of those projects may be economical for the one-to-one for CFD agreement, but maybe not for an auction process. And also, international developers will be looking at Poland and thinking that, well, if we can get our projects across the line now, that fits my portfolio or my asset development plan across the globe. But if they're not having to look at 2025 and 27 before they can get anything in Poland, will Brazil be a market at that point? So it could jeopardize the entire market. Now, that doesn't mean that that will happen, but there's now a risk. So all of a sudden, Poland has a political risk. So the main thing is that the Polish market and everyone who works in the Polish market will be looking at the politics as hopefully that act gets onto the floor of the Parliament in January, and we try and hope that that gets through Parliament pretty quick. So then, just to finish on, we've got, so thanks for that. We've got an OWC white paper on the geohazards in the Polish Baltic area. Now that's available from our website and also from our country manager in Poland, Łukasz. These slides will be issued after the webinar, so please, go onto our website, download that, email Łukasz. So on that note, I'd just like to say thanks to Gunnar again and hand everyone back.
Excellent, perfect. Thank you very much, John. Yeah, for this very insightful and detailed overview of offshore wind in Poland. Yeah, conscious of time, I think we might have time for one question to all three of you. So what would you say would be the #1 challenge or the #1 risk for offshore wind in the respective countries? And just a very quick 30-second answer, if there is such a thing as a one sort of #1 challenge for Spain, France, and Poland, what would it be? Maybe, yeah, Luis, Kevin, and then John.
Okay, I think the challenge would be just to establish enough pipeline and be patient enough to let the offshore industry to establish in Spain, while competing with well-established sites such as onshore and PV. But I'm quite positive, to be honest. I think the government has got it quite right, and I think they are betting on offshore wind, and I think they're going to be patient if no changes happen politically in the coming years. But I think it's quite established position generally that offshore wind is something to bet on.
That sounds great. Kevin, what about France?
So France, I think, has shown that they're able to attract international players, that they have an open playing field. I think there's been a bit of a perception that EDF has won a lot of the previous tenders, that it's kind of only for big French players. I think that perception is not fully correct. So I think one challenge will be just to confirm that this is an open field for all international players. I think people understand that, but there's a little bit of reticence from the track record of who's won the previous tenders. And then the other thing to keep in mind is the coordination with RTE, with the offshore substation, just making sure that the sites that are planned, central planning of the sites that are public inquiries that are done before the bid are successful, that there's sufficient grid capacity, and that RTE is able to build on time. I think that will also be part of the key question going forward as well.
Perfect, thanks. Sounds good. And then John, yeah, the number one question, the number one challenge in Poland.
Well, with the way that I finished, you shouldn't be surprised that it's actually getting the Offshore Act through Parliament. The issue is that the excuse was for the reason that Parliament's not sitting is because of COVID, and of course the pandemic's impacting everything. But the worry is that actually the belief is that there's an element of camouflage there, that there's interscene strife in the Polish government at the moment between the majority party, the minority party, and that keeping MPs out of the Parliament building is part of trying to manage that process, and that's fine, but that doesn't help the Offshore Act. I don't think that has any impact on the appetite for Poland for offshore wind or the government. But it's like anything else. If you've got political upheaval, putting things into law or policy tends to fall down the priority. So we have to hope that does actually hit the floor in January, and that it gets through Parliament in a sensible and speedy way. And that is it, because otherwise there's a lot of work that's been done in the Polish market that if that can get into place, then that market is ready to get projects into proper construction in 2022.
Thank you very much. Sounds good. Yeah, I think that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So thank you very much again to our three speakers, Luis Gonzalez Pinto, Kevin Feldman, and John McGaskill. And thanks to all of you at home listening and dialing into today's webinar. Please join us again next month in December for our next WFO webinar. And yeah, that leaves me with thanking all of you again, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.